Breaking news at this hour, a border crossing between the U.S. and Canada is closed.
Busiest border crossing between the U.S. and Canada for nearly a week is over. But those protesting COVID mandates are still making a mess of streets in places like Ottawa.
What happens when a single decision from the White House doesn't just rattle politics, but transforms America's closest ally into its deadliest economic rival? Imagine this, a $5 billion bridge built to stand as a shining monument of eternal friendship, suddenly reduced to a symbol of betrayal and miscalculation.
Next tonight, we move on to that tense standoff at the U.S.-Canadian border. It appears to be coming to an end.
The Ambassador Bridge, the vital artery linking Detroit to Windsor, shut down entirely as furious protesters swarmed both sides of the border. But this story runs far deeper than protests, far beyond tariffs or trade disputes. This is the story of how one man's unchecked ego nearly handed Canada the ultimate victory, while America stood helpless as its greatest advantage slipped away. The fallout? Nothing short of catastrophic. Stay with us, because what you're about to uncover will change the way you see power, alliances, and the true cost of miscalculation. The bridge that changed everything. The massive concrete towers of the Gordie Howe International Bridge rise from the Detroit River like monuments to ambition. $5 billion of steel, concrete, and dreams stretched across the water, connecting Michigan to Ontario in what was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of North American unity. Politicians on both sides had praised it as the crown jewel of cross-border cooperation, a testament to decades of friendship between neighboring nations. But monuments have a way of becoming reminders of things we'd rather forget. What was once celebrated as a bridge to prosperity has transformed into something entirely different. A stark reminder of how quickly trust can crumble and how dramatically the balance of power can shift. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. A structure built to bring two countries closer together would ultimately drive them further apart than they had been in generations. The story begins not with construction crews or ribbon-cutting ceremonies, but with the man whose name adorns the bridge itself. Gordie Howe, the legendary hockey player known as Mr. Hockey.
The man known as Mr. Hockey, the only man to score 800-plus goals in a career other than Wayne Gretzky, one of the truly greats of the sport.
Spent his career gracefully moving between American and Canadian teams, embodying the seamless relationship that existed between the two nations. His legacy represented everything the bridge was meant to achieve: cooperation, mutual respect, and shared success. Yet as construction neared completion in early 2025, a very different kind of player was about to take center stage. This player wasn't known for grace or cooperation. Instead, he was known for disruption, for turning allies into adversaries, with nothing more than a social media post. The transformation of the Gordie Howe Bridge from symbol of unity to monument of division was about to begin. Workers had been putting the finishing touches on the massive span throughout the winter months. Traffic studies projected thousands of vehicles would cross daily, carrying goods worth billions of dollars annually between the two economies. The bridge represented more than infrastructure. It was a physical manifestation of the integrated North American economy that had developed over decades of careful diplomatic work. The tweet that shattered decades. March 2025 started like any other month in the world of international trade. Goods flowed freely across the border, factories hummed with production, and supply chains operated with clockwork precision. Then came the digital explosion that changed everything. In just 280 characters, Donald Trump announced a devastating 25% tariff.
Breaking news out of the White House, where U.S. President Donald Trump has signed tariffs on imports from Canada.
On all automotive imports from Canada and Mexico, justified by claims of national security threats. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Within hours, the carefully orchestrated dance of North American manufacturing ground to a halt. Factories that had operated on just-in-time delivery systems suddenly found themselves starved of essential components. Assembly lines that had run 3 shifts for years were forced to shut down as parts shipments sat frozen at border crossings. But the real shock wasn't economic, it was emotional. For Canadians, being labeled a security threat by their closest neighbor felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. This wasn't China or Russia being targeted. This was Canada, the country that had stood shoulder to shoulder with America through 2 world wars and the Cold War and countless other challenges. The psychological impact rippled through boardrooms, factory floors, and coffee shops across the country. In Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, anger erupted immediately. Auto workers who had spent decades building cars alongside their American counterparts suddenly found themselves painted as threats to national security. Union halls filled with furious voices demanding action. The mood shifted from disbelief to rage to something far more dangerous: determination. The trust that had taken generations to build evaporated overnight. But what Trump and his advisors failed to anticipate was the response that was already taking shape in the corridors of power in Ottawa. While Washington celebrated what it saw as a decisive show of strength, Canada's leadership was quietly preparing a counterattack that would reshape the entire continental economy. The master strategist's calculated response. While protest chants echoed across the border and headlines screamed of trade wars, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the quiet offices of Canada's capital. Mark Carney, the economist who had guided Canada through earlier crises, was orchestrating what would become one of the most sophisticated economic counterstrikes in modern history. Carney understood something Trump's team had missed. In the modern global economy, relationships mattered more than raw power. While America was burning bridges, Canada was building them. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in execution. Instead of responding with angry rhetoric or tit-for-tat tariffs, Canada would restructure its entire economic relationship with the United States. The first weapon in Canada's arsenal was the Reciprocal Framework Regulation, an automated system that instantly matched any American tariff with an equivalent Canadian response. No delays, no debates, no time for lobbyists to mobilize. It was economic warfare on autopilot, ensuring every protectionist move from Washington immediately boomeranged back to hurt American exporters. But the masterstroke was yet to come. The government announced the BEATSCO program, a $10 billion initiative helping domestic companies reduce dependence on American suppliers. The condition? To receive funding, firms had to cut U.S. inputs by 50% within 2 years. Overnight, decades-old relationships dissolved as Canadian companies scrambled for alternatives in Europe, Asia, and at home. Psychological warfare was just as crucial. Carney began speaking publicly about building a united Canadian economy, language that sent shivers through American trade officials. This wasn't about tariffs or short disputes. It was about permanently reducing Canada's economic integration with the United States. As spring turned to summer, the effects became impossible to ignore. American foundries that had supplied Canadian manufacturers for decades suddenly found their contracts canceled. Small machine shops in Michigan and Ohio, the backbone of American manufacturing, began laying off workers as their biggest customers looked elsewhere for supplies. The very communities that had voted for Trump, believing his promises about bringing jobs back, were among the first to feel the devastating consequences of his trade war. The domino effect unleashes economic chaos. The beauty of Carney's strategy lay in its precision. Rather than striking at obvious, heavily protected targets, Canada aimed directly at the weak points in America's economic armor, the small suppliers and specialized manufacturers that quietly formed the backbone of the integrated North American supply chain. The results were swift, devastating, and merciless. In Wayne County, Michigan, the very heart of American automotive manufacturing,
Michigan lawmakers are deeply concerned about the impact tariffs could have on the auto industry. Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Congresswoman Debbie Dingell are meeting with auto industry leaders to answer some questions.
Family-owned foundries that had endured the Great Depression, multiple recessions, and even the catastrophic 2008 financial crisis began shuttering their doors at an alarming pace. These weren't casualties of foreign competition or technological disruption. They were victims of their own government's reckless trade policy. The irony was glaring and bitter. Trump's loudly proclaimed America First agenda was, in practice, destroying American businesses from within. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada was experiencing an unexpected renaissance, unlike anything seen in decades. The Green Hydro Corridor project, a sweeping transcontinental infrastructure initiative, became the largest single construction project in Canadian history. Every pipe, every steel beam, every component was sourced domestically, creating a virtuous economic cycle that reignited dormant factories and put thousands of Canadians back to work. The transformation was most dramatic in the nation's steel industry. Plants in Ontario that had been limping along at partial capacity for years suddenly found themselves running at full throttle, operating around the clock to meet the insatiable demand generated by the infrastructure boom. Communities once fading into silence as manufacturing jobs disappeared overseas were suddenly alive with the sounds of progress, their streets bustling again. Canada was seizing Trump's trade war as the perfect excuse to rebuild its industrial base from the ground up, and for the first time in a generation, it was winning. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: lobsters. Both countries harvested the same species from the same North Atlantic waters, but Canada had spent years building trade relationships that America had abandoned. When European and Asian buyers needed to choose between American and Canadian suppliers, the decision was easy. Canada offered the same product with better trade terms and more reliable relationships. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Canadian lobster exports soared past $3.2 billion, while American sales plummeted to less than $500 million. In Maine, fishing families that had worked the same waters for generations suddenly found themselves unable to compete. The same boats, the same traps, the same ocean, but completely different outcomes based solely on which flag flew over their home port. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual industries. At the Port of Vancouver, American goods suddenly encountered bureaucratic mazes that made the old Soviet system look efficient. New origin verification requirements meant that U.S. companies had to document the source of every component in their products, creating delays that made shipping to Canada more expensive and time-consuming than sending goods to some developing countries. The final confrontation and bitter victory. The tension that had been building for months finally exploded on the international stage at the G7 summit in Canmore, Alberta. What was supposed to be a routine diplomatic gathering suddenly transformed into the scene of the most heated confrontation between North American leaders in living memory. Behind closed doors, Trump and Carney engaged in what witnesses later described as a brutal, unrelenting verbal battle that left other world leaders stunned into silence, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch history unfold. For the first time since World War II, Canada was not standing behind the United States, it was standing against it. The alliance that had defined North American geopolitics for 3 generations was fracturing in real time, and the entire world was watching with bated breath. The implications were staggering. If America couldn't maintain its relationship with Canada, its closest and most trusted ally, then how could it possibly hope to lead anywhere else on the global stage? September 17, 2025, should have been a day of celebration. The Gordie Howe International Bridge finally opened to great fanfare, with officials from both countries gathering for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Cameras captured smiling politicians, hopeful speeches, and cheering crowds as the first vehicles crossed the magnificent span. At first glance, it looked like a triumph of cooperation, a shining symbol of shared vision and unity, but the celebration masked a much deeper failure. Early projections had optimistically estimated that over 10,000 vehicles would cross daily, generating the revenue needed to justify the bridge's massive investment. Instead, actual traffic limped along at barely 6,700 vehicles per day, a shortfall that threatened to turn the bridge from a proud asset into a looming financial burden. Most truckers stubbornly continued using the aging Ambassador Bridge, preferring its lower tolls, familiar routes, and established logistics, despite its outdated infrastructure. Meanwhile, the state-of-the-art Gordie Howe Bridge, with all its technological marvels, promises of efficiency, and symbolic importance, often stood embarrassingly empty, while its ancient rival carried the bulk of cross-border traffic. It was a bitter reminder that political triumph did not always translate into practical success. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Trump's tariffs, designed to strengthen American manufacturing and bring jobs home, had instead pushed Canada toward economic independence and made the symbol of U.S.-Canada cooperation into a monument to miscalculation. The bridge that was supposed to prove American trade leadership instead demonstrated how quickly allies could become competitors when trust evaporated. Studies began emerging that quantified the long-term damage. American industrial exports were projected to decline by 1.2% by 2030, while Canada's more diversified economy was positioned for growth despite short-term disruption. The country that had prepared an exit strategy was thriving, while the one that had assumed its dominance would last forever found itself increasingly isolated. The human cost was perhaps the most tragic element of the entire saga. In Detroit, assembly line workers who had built their lives around steady employment found themselves reduced to single-shift schedules or unemployment entirely. Across the river in Windsor, diner waitresses noticed their regular customers, auto workers whose shifts had been cut, simply stopped coming in for their usual meals. Even something as simple as selling a hamburger had become dependent on the state of U.S.-Canada relations. The interconnectedness that had once been a source of strength and prosperity had become a vulnerability that a single tweet could exploit. Communities on both sides of the border were paying the price for decisions made in Washington by people who had never walked a factory floor or worried about making rent. The unintended revolution. What began as a straightforward trade dispute had evolved into something far more profound. A fundamental restructuring of North American economic relationships that would outlast any single presidency or political cycle. Canada's response to Trump's tariffs wasn't just defensive, it was transformational. The infrastructure investments, supply chain diversification, and new trade relationships that Canada developed in response to American aggression created a more resilient and independent economy. The short-term pain of adjusting to life without American suppliers had been turned into long-term gain through domestic development and alternative partnerships. Financial markets told the story with typical clarity. The Canadian dollar strengthened and held steady despite the trade turmoil, reflecting global confidence in Ottawa's economic management. Meanwhile, U.S. markets gyrated wildly as investors grew wary of Washington's unpredictable trade policies. Capital began flowing toward the more stable northern neighbor, accelerating the very trends that Trump's policies were supposed to reverse. The transformation was visible in unexpected places. Canadian steel production, which had been in decline for years, suddenly roared back to life. Mining operations that had been mothballed were reopened. Research and development spending increased as companies sought Canadian alternatives to American suppliers. What had started as an economic attack had accidentally triggered a Canadian industrial renaissance. For American workers and businesses, the reality was far harsher. Small manufacturers found themselves cut out of supply chains they had been part of for decades. Export businesses watched their Canadian customers disappear, often permanently, as new relationships formed with competitors in other countries. The America First slogan had become a cruel joke for the communities that had believed in it most fervently. The geopolitical implications were equally significant. Canada's success in weathering and ultimately benefiting from Trump's trade war sent a powerful message to other American allies. There were alternatives to simply accepting whatever Washington demanded. The unipolar moment that had defined the post-Cold War era was drawing to a close, replaced by a more complex, multipolar world where even the closest allies could chart bold and independent courses without fear of immediate collapse. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis revealed the true limits of American economic power in an interconnected age. The long-standing assumption that other countries would simply absorb whatever punishment America chose to impose proved disastrously wrong. By trying to wield economic coercion as a weapon to maintain dominance, the United States had instead accelerated the very global trends of multipolarity it was desperately trying to prevent. The damage was not just financial, it was reputational, leaving allies more cautious and rivals more emboldened. The Gordie Howe International Bridge now stands as a towering monument to unintended consequences. Originally built to symbolize eternal friendship and trust, it instead became a stark reminder of how quickly relationships could shift and how devastating the costs of miscalculation could be. The bridge that was supposed to prove American leadership ended up demonstrating something far more sobering, that even the closest, most time-tested alliances have breaking points. And once crossed, the path back is neither simple nor guaranteed. What started with a tweet designed to show strength had revealed weakness. What began as a demonstration of America first had ended with America alone. The greatest irony of all was that in trying to make America great again, Trump's policies had instead made Canada more independent, more resilient, and ultimately more competitive than it had been in generations. The lesson is clear. In the modern global economy, burning bridges, whether literal or metaphorical, is a luxury that no country, not even the most powerful, can afford. The trust that takes generations to build can be destroyed in moments, but rebuilding it may prove impossible. The Gordie Howe International Bridge will continue to span the Detroit River, but the relationship it was meant to celebrate may never be the same. This stunning reversal of fortune shows us that in today's interconnected world, even superpowers can find themselves outmaneuvered by smaller, smarter neighbors who refuse to be bullied. The economic chess match between Trump and Carney wasn't even close. One player was thinking several moves ahead, while the other was still trying to understand the rules of the game. If this incredible tale of economic warfare and unintended consequences has opened your eyes to how quickly global power dynamics can shift, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories of political miscalculation and strategic brilliance. The next chapter of this economic drama is already being written, and you won't want to miss what happens next.